Hi, Calvary Kids. Thanks for tuning in for another video series in our series that the grown-ups are also doing. Just a reminder that your parents are also learning about these same stories alongside you, which I think is really cool. It is officially November, which is crazy. I know last week's video was November 1st, but I'm just thinking, man, we've been doing these videos since March, I think, or like the beginning of April. And so it's just crazy. I'm really thankful that you guys are still tuning in and still letting me, speak some Jesus into your life, which I think is really cool. So today I wanted to ask you guys, start off our lesson by asking you guys, have you ever seen a magic trick happen? Or like an illusion? Maybe someone makes a coin disappear and like grabs it from behind your ear, or maybe you pick a card and someone is able to shuffle them all up and then still find your card. There's lots of cool magic tricks and illusions that people are able to do. And have you ever wondered how they work? If you actually look into how some of these work, it's actually really pretty cool and requires a lot of practice on that person's part to be able to get it done so smooth. And those are kind of like fun little tricks to play, right? Fun little tricks to see. But has someone ever pulled a trick on you that wasn't really that fun? Maybe they were fooling you, or they played a prank on you, and some pranks are small and harmless and fun, and some of them are just mean, right? And some of them are not at all nice. So today we're going to talk about a real person in the Bible who played a trick, and it shows us that God can use any situation. God has a plan for everything, and our faith fact today is that God's plan is best. We talked a little bit last week about how, that Sarah and Abraham had to wait a really long time, and they tried to make the plan happen on their own, but they needed to trust God. And so today we're going to talk about how God can turn any situation, bad or good, and he can turn it around and use it for what's best in our lives. And so we're actually going to cover short, like two types of stories, really. So our first story is about some real people who lived a really long time ago. Again, we've been starting at the beginning of the Bible, and, this was thousands of years ago, which is crazy to think about, right? Sometimes it's hard to think about like 30 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago, but we're talking way back. And so they didn't have the internet or electricity or cars or any of that. But God is still the same God that was for them as he is for us, which is a really cool thing. The things that the people learned back then are still relevant to us today. And so there was a married man and a woman who really, really wanted to have a baby, just kind of like our story last week, but this one was a little different. They really wanted to have a baby, but the woman wasn't able to get pregnant, and it was just, really tough. And there are a lot of stories in the Bible actually about this same subject. We talked about one of them last week. But today we're going to look at Isaac, who was the son of Abraham and Sarah from our story last week. And if you remember, Isaac's mom couldn't get pregnant. It was really tough. And so the story today is about how, this mom really wanted to have a baby and she couldn't get pregnant. And so we're actually going to read in Genesis 25. So Genesis chapter 25, we're going to start in verse 21. And it said, Isaac, who was this woman's husband, Rebekah's husband, pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife, and because she was unable to have children. The Lord answered Isaac's prayer, and Rebekah became pregnant with twins. How cool is that? Now listen, I know some of you, maybe your parents, maybe you're the product of these prayers, and maybe your parents really tried to have kids and they couldn't for the longest time, and then you came around and you answered a prayer. That's awesome. Or maybe, you ended up with your grown-up in a unique way, because not everybody's parents actually gave birth to them. And there's just a lot of unique ways that people become families, right? There's lots of different ways. And so I think it's always cool looking at stories about family and seeing how unique and different they are, even throughout the Bible. And even just today in our church, there are lots of unique, different kinds of families. But one thing that is the same with all of them is God loves every type of family. God loves the families who, maybe you're living with your grandparents, or God loves the families that you're living with siblings, or maybe your grandparents live with you and your parents, or maybe you were adopted. God loves all those, and that's really cool, and he can use all of them. And so there's this, here we're going to talk about a family that God used, even though it started out in a difficult situation. And so Isaac and Rebekah had twins, and it was really cool. And then the next verse says, but the two children struggled with each other in her womb. So she went to ask the Lord about it. Why is this happening to me? And the Lord said, the sons in your womb will become two nations. And from the very beginning, the two nations will be rivals. One nation will be stronger than the other, and your older son will serve your younger son. Man, that's kind of tough. So it's a situation that, man, yes, finally, this mommy's belly is growing, and you can feel the kicks in the stomach, but then you could also feel that, man, there was a lot of kicks, and they were struggling a lot, and what's happening? And God is basically telling Rebekah, like, hey, your two sons are going to be rivals, and he's kind of predicting what's going to happen down the line. And I don't know if maybe you have heard this story before, but I want you to kind of think, does anyone know Isaac and Rebekah's twin sons? What are their names? I'll let you pause for a second. If you're watching with your mom or dad, or whatever grown-ups in your house, maybe they know. It's actually, the twins are Jacob and Esau. And so we're going to talk about, there are main characters for today, Jacob and Esau. And so you fast forward a few years, and the babies are grown up, and even though they were twins, they're very different. Esau was the older one, and he was hairy, and he loved to hunt, and Jacob was the younger twin, and he actually preferred to stay in the tents and cook with his mom. And who did God say was going to serve who? If you remember in that verse, God said the older son is going to serve the younger one. And so the time came when Isaac was very old. And, he was really old, and he was preparing, he was going to pass away. And so he wanted to bless his older son Esau and make him in charge of everything. Because when Isaac was going to pass away, somebody had to become in charge, right? And so Isaac and Rebekah are very old. And so it was kind of like Esau was going to take over the family business, kind of. Like he was going to run things. And so he was going to put him in charge over his younger brother. And I don't know if he forgot what God told Rebekah about the younger son being in charge of the older son, or maybe he just wasn't sure this was the avenue it was going to take. Maybe he thought it was going to happen differently. Maybe he didn't know, but Rebekah had a choice to make. And either she could trust God that the younger son would rule over the older son at some point, trust God's words to come true, or she could take matters into her own hands. Because Rebekah really loved Jacob. She wanted him to be in charge, and she wanted God's plan to follow through, but she didn't want to wait. And so she took matters into her own hands, and she made a plan. And while Esau, the older brother, was out hunting, because that's what he did, right? He loved to do that. Rebekah actually came up with a plan to trick her husband. And she wanted her son Jacob to get the blessing and him be in charge of everything over Esau. And so she tricked Isaac. So we're going to read what happened in Genesis chapter 27, verse 8. It says, now my son, listen to me. Do exactly as I tell you. Go out to the flocks and bring me 2 fine young goats. I'll use them to prepare your father's favorite dish. And then take the food to your father so he can eat it and bless you before he dies. And so Jacob goes on to say, we're very different. He's going to be able to tell Jacob, or Esau's really hairy, and there's all these differences. And so they come up with a plan that he was going to go in disguised as Esau. He was going to wear some stuff so that it felt like his arms were hairy. And they were basically had this whole plan to trick Isaac. Because Rebekah knew what God said about Jacob, and she knew that Jacob was going to be a great nation, but she didn't trust that God was going to follow through with it. She didn't trust that it was going to happen in time. And so instead of trusting God's plan, she took matters into her own, and what do you guys think happened? Do you guys think Isaac fell for it? He was very old, probably couldn't see and hear very well. That happens when you get old. So what do you think happened? I'll let you talk about it for a second, but Jacob obeyed her. Jacob said, okay, Mom, let's do this. And Jacob could have said no, and I'm not going to trick my dad, but he just said, let's do this. And he went to see his father, and the trick worked. And Isaac gave Jacob his blessing instead of Esau. And it was like Jacob was in charge now. Jacob was in charge of the family. He was in charge of everything now. And when Esau came back and brought the stew to his father, they realized that they had been tricked. But it was too late, because it was like a promise, but more than that. It was like a covenant. Like, it was really serious. And it was basically Isaac passing everything on to Jacob, and it couldn't be taken back. How would you feel if someone tricked you like that? All along it was God's plan for Jacob to become a great nation, and for Esau to become a nation too, but to also serve his younger brother. All along it was God's plan for that to happen. But Rebekah and Jacob didn't trust God to follow through the way they thought he should. And so they took matters into their own hands, and they ended up tricking Isaac in his last days. I mean, that's tough. And when you get tricked and when you get fooled, like we talked about earlier, when you get pranked, and it doesn't feel good, right? Sometimes when you trick somebody, it can really damage the relationship. Esau was really upset with what happened too, because he felt like he was missed out on something that he deserved, and so he wanted to kill his brother. And Jacob had no choice. He had to run away and hide because Esau was very upset. And what was our faith fact again? God's plan is always best. God was going to make his plan happen, but Jacob didn't want to wait. And eventually Jacob would come back, and he did restore his relationship with his brother. And they became friends again. And both of them did become great nations. And Jacob, later became known as Israel. And you've probably heard of Israel, right? Many great people from the Bible are descendants of Jacob, because God made him into a great nation, including Jesus eventually came from the line of Jacob. And although, we'll never probably experience where our mom puts hair on our arms, or where our brother wants to kill us because we tricked him, we do all have a choice on whether we trust God or not. And we can know that God's plan is best. And so, sometimes we get really excited and we want to jump ahead to things. Like, man, we just want to be older. Or, man, we just want the school year to be done. Or, man, if 2020 could just finish up and be over, right? Well, we have to remember that God has a plan for us, and God has a plan for the rest of 2020. God has a plan for the rest of your school year. God has a plan for you in between now and graduating high school and moving away, or graduating middle school, or whatever you guys are looking forward to. God has a plan to make those things happen, but don't get lost in the middle. Don't try to speed things up like Jacob and Rebekah did by fooling people or by cutting corners. God's plan is best for us, and if we trust him to follow through, it's always going to be better than what we can do ourselves. So next time you want to speed up, or maybe you just can't wait for things to happen and you want to try to make it through on your own, I want you to remember this story, and that God's plan is best, and he's always going to follow through for us. So thanks for watching. Again, if you want to read more about that story between Jacob and Esau, I'd encourage you guys to do that. You can find it in Genesis 25, and it goes a while, and you can even read more about Jacob and Esau and how they became friends again, and how they forgave each other, and how, God did make them into two great nations. So it's a really cool story. Maybe that's something that you and your grown-ups could read about this week. But again, thanks for tuning in, and I will see you guys next week.